Hey, good morning, family. Good to be able to be together this morning as we worship through hearing of the Word. And I'm really excited to be back at this. It's been the whole month of August. I planned to be away from for those first couple of weeks, but then planned to take the whole month off of preaching just to give other guys an opportunity and to just kind of focus on what's happening in the fall now. And that was good. That was helpful. But boy, did I miss just getting to spend time studying the Word and preparing it for sharing with everybody. And so I'm glad to be back at it this morning. And before we get into our time in the Word, I want to remind you just a few announcements that we have. Next weekend, for example, is our church picnic. So we're excited to welcome you to that. If you're watching online and you've been mostly doing that because of discomfort with coming to live services, I would invite you to try it out. We have been meeting outside. We've said weather permitting, but so far we've been outside every week, and it's our intention to continue to do so. Even today, it's Saturday, it's raining. I'm still planning that we'll go outside, but don't tell everybody that yet. They might not come. But I do invite you to come try it out. We've got lots of room under the breezeway. We expanded out with a couple of pop-ups. Try to keep the rain off. Try to keep the weather out. Dress warm, but then stay for lunch. And what we're doing this year is bring your own food. We won't be sharing anything. We'll provide probably some canned pop or water, that kind of thing. But in general, we'll invite you to just bring along your own food and join us for some games outside. We'll be outside the whole time. Even if it's raining, I think we'll just have to visit outside, even if we don't want to go play games out there or whatever. But I invite you to come out and be a part of that with us. Be good to reconnect and just engage with you in new ways again. Secondly, we're really on the lookout for volunteers, particularly for our kids ministry. Got a few different things. We always need help with production, so sound, lighting, video, even decorating the stage. Brooklyn was here this last week trying to make things look pretty good up here, and she's done a great job, but there's always more to do. And so if you're willing to help out in some of those ways, but particularly what I'm kind of most concerned about going into the fall is kids ministry. And so if you are at all willing to help out with kids, specifically clubs, and helping to administrate and run Kids Alive on Sunday mornings. I know that this week I got an email from a community person just asking what's happening with kids clubs this week, and I don't know how to answer her. So if you can help us out with that, we'd love to see some of those programs return as restrictions allow. And finally, want to let you know about pilot groups for our missional community stuff. We're going to be trying that out starting next Sunday, and I'm hoping if you're going to come to that, I want you to sign up today. So you can head over to sunshineridge.churchcenter.com. Center is spelled the American way, TER, and sign up to join us for that. There's no cost. It is a big ask because we're asking you to commit to a lot. There's a lot of reading. There's more details on the site. I want to invite you to come and be a part of that, because as we move forward as a church, our hope is to kind of restructure around these communities where every Sunday still happens, but it might look a little different as we celebrate life together during the week. And so yeah, that's our intention for the coming year. If there's any questions that you might have that you'd want to find out about, feel free to email me, tim@sunshineridge.church, and be happy to help you out in that way. So as we re-enter a new ministry year this week, we're going to come back to our series in the Gospel of Mark. So now this is thinking way back. I know I'm asking you to go back a long ways, but if you can remember that far back, when we left Mark in July, we'd left off with the story of a blind man. In it, we saw Jesus heal a blind man, but it takes 2 tries, and this is the only time that we ever see Jesus have to repeat a healing, and it made us have to stop and wonder, what's going on here? Why did Jesus have to do 2 healings? And the answer, of course, is that he didn't fail the first time. Rather, the 2 healings were a demonstration of what was about to happen in the lives of the disciples and their hearts as they spend time with Jesus. The partial healing of the man's eyes. Remember, he says, oh, I can see people walking, but they look like trees. They look like trees walking. That partial healing shows us where the disciples' hearts are at right now. They've been partially healed. They think they get what Jesus is here for. They think they get what he's trying to do, but they don't quite understand. It's like trees walking at this point. And this is going to be clearly demonstrated for us today as we jump back into Mark's gospel. The saying goes that there are two things that none of us can escape, and those are death and taxes. And today we're going to see that there's also a question that none of us can avoid having to answer as well. So if you want to pick up in Mark chapter 8 with me, we're going to be reading verses 27 to 33. Just invite you to join along. If you have a Bible, open it up. Let's read through, mark things up, highlight things, underline things that are important to you, because it's always important for us to just be able to come back to those things easily. And so Mark chapter 8, 27 through 33. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing the disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So from this point on in Mark's gospel, Jesus has turned a corner. Mark spent the first 8 chapters introducing us to and establishing Jesus' authority. And he's this divine, his divine authority, establishing his divine authority, that Jesus is God become man. Now, if you think back to our time before the summer, we consistently saw Jesus doing things that only God can do, and claiming to be things, claiming to do things that only God can be and do, and teaching with an authority that no one had ever seen before. And the overwhelming question that people were left with after an encounter with Jesus was, who is this? The Pharisees asked it, the scribes asked it, Herod asked it, and even the disciples have asked it a few times. So now readers of Mark's gospel at this point should overwhelmingly be able to answer that for them. This is God become man. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ. In Psalm 65, we read about God's incredible power. Verse 5, Psalm 65:5. "By awesome deeds you answer us with righteousness, O God of our salvation. The hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might." And now this is God who stills the roaring of the seas. Who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. Well, who stills the roaring of the seas and the waves? Well, God alone. So then Jesus gets up from a nap in Mark chapter 4, and he stills the roaring sea. So logic tells us that Mark is claiming, at least, that Jesus is God, and that this God-man is the Messiah that they've all been waiting for. All the way back to the beginning of this gospel, in Mark 1:1, he introduces his purpose for writing his gospel, explaining that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, one thing that we haven't really tackled yet, because it hasn't arisen a ton, is that word Christ. The word that we translate Christ is Christos. It is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. Mark's expressed purpose then is to show us how Jesus, the Messiah, is God. And he's done that. Now his tone shifts to, as he begins to show us what kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be. So Mark 1-8, in Act 1, we've seen Jesus' authority and divinity being established. Now we're going to see what Messiah will look like and what he does. So still at this point, Peter and the disciples, and indeed all of Judaism, are still expecting a very different Messiah. Under King David's leadership, Israel had lived well. So So back 1,000 years earlier, Israel had lived very well with David as their king. And still, centuries later, when people talked about Israel's glory days, that was that time of Israel under King David, and the promised Messiah was prophesied to come from the Davidic line. And so this new David was expected to come and conquer the Romans and reestablish the Jerusalem as the center of the world. This is the contemporary Jews' expectation of Messiah, of what the Christ will do. Now, with all of that in mind, let's come back to our passage for today. Now, some of the commentators I was reading, they suggest that maybe Jesus was taking the disciples away for something of a retreat. Mark's gospel has been nonstop action. It seems like Jesus is always surrounded by people, and they needed a break, and this needed break is somewhat of an anomaly. In a few weeks, granted, we'll be taking away our youth leaders up to Green Bay for a retreat, and there will be other youth leaders from all over BC. We started doing leaders retreats, long time ago, because the school year is insane on youth leaders. And I'm not saying that to the exclusion of any other volunteer position. You're all busy, but my experience has been a lot with youth leaders. Week in and week out, they are investing in students. They're praying for them. They're answering very difficult questions and so much more, all while trying to maintain their own spiritual health, hold down full-time jobs or go to school, and sometimes even raise their own kids. And many of them are involved in more than one ministry. And so that weekend retreat is just this dedicated moment to take a breath before we get into that ministry year, before they begin to pour themselves out. And our youth leaders probably volunteer up to 10 hours a week, sometimes more, as youth leaders alone. For Jesus and his disciples, that was their lives. Our youth leaders spend 10 hours a week probably as a volunteer. This was their very lives. Every moment they were awake was ministry. Every moment they were awake, they were crowded by people. So how much more did they need a retreat? And even now, if we look in verse 34, we find out there's still a crowd that's following them. It says, calling the crowd to him and his disciples, and then Jesus taught them a little more. So as they're on their way, Jesus asked the disciples a question. Hey, we've been doing all this stuff. After all the things that the people have seen and heard, what's the word out there? What do people think that I am? Who do they say that I am? And so they tell them that there's a few theories out there. If we go back a little bit, King Herod, who had put John the Baptist to death, speculated that Jesus is John the Baptist. He's come back to life. Others are speculating other kind of end timesy type stuff, like Elijah, or at least an Elijah-like figure who was expected to return before the day of the Lord. So they're saying, well, maybe it's Elijah. There was an expectation also that before God's final judgment, Moses, a prophet like Moses, was expected to come. And so they go, the disciples start calling out these prevailing theories. So they say John the Baptist or Elijah, that returned Elijah-like prophet, or one of the prophets like Moses. So then Jesus kind of doubles down here. He goes, but what about you guys? You've seen everything. These guys have all seen bits and pieces. They've heard little bits. They've seen little bits, but you've heard all my teaching. You've seen all the things that we've done together. Who do you say that I am? Now, just like death and taxes, this is that same question that none of us can escape. Who do you say that Jesus is? Some people talk about Jesus as if he's just a great teacher, or just a great man, or a good example of how to treat people. And some false religions actually even define Jesus as something other than fully God. But the reality is that if Jesus isn't God, he's nothing. If Jesus isn't God, he's not even a good man. He's not a good example. In fact, he's either a con man or a complete nut. So that question still hangs in the air for everyone, and for me and for you. Who do you say that Jesus is? Well, Peter, as spokesman for all of them, declares, you are the Christos. You're the Messiah. You might be tempted to think that this is a moment of triumph for Peter and the disciples, but what comes next reveals to us that they've only been partially spiritually healed. Like the blind man from that previous story, they're still seeing people, but they look like trees walking. And this is why Act 2 of Mark's gospel is all about defining the Messiah. See, they're still expecting that soldier king, that conquering soldier king of a Messiah. So when Jesus starts to teach that he has to suffer and die, I think they panic. Verse 32 tells us that he was teaching this to them very plainly, so there's no parables. He's just clearly explaining to them, I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to suffer. They're going to kill me. And then clearly this is the exact moment that Peter stopped listening, because he also explains that he's going to be raised again in 3 days. But Peter doesn't hear that part. And you have to love Peter. Good old bull in a china shop Peter. I feel like I relate to Peter real well. He thinks Jesus is going nuts. He's really concerned about Jesus at this point, so he pulls him aside and starts to get after him. Remember, Jesus, we just agreed that you're the Messiah. We just agreed that you're the Christos. You're the one who's going to restore Israel's fortunes. You're the one who is going to, you can't be killed. He must not have pulled Jesus too far aside, because in his reply, Jesus answers all of them. He says to the disciple, turning and seeing the disciples, so they're not that far away, he rebuked them. And so you can sort of imagine the disciples all kind of nodding their heads as Jesus is being put in his place, right? As Peter is scolding Jesus. But all that Peter has done is demonstrate that partial walking trees type of healing. He needs Jesus to lay his hands on him again so that his sight can be fully restored. And Mark is going to spend the rest of the time of his gospel showing how Jesus will do that. There's this pattern that develops. This is the first of 3 stories where it starts off with the disciples have it seems like a pretty brilliant moment, and then it's followed by a failure. And then it's followed by a period of Jesus teaching what true discipleship actually looks like. And it's true that Peter and the others, I don't think they're trying to be deliberately sinful at this point. In fact, they think they're helping to get Jesus over his defeatist attitude. Jesus, you can't talk like that. I know we've had a rough week, but you can't talk like that. But they're misguided. Maybe they've been deceived, but their problem is that they're thinking about what's right in front of them. Messiah is going to make Israel cool again. They're going to be the new Toronto, you know what I mean? The center of the universe. They're thinking too small. A contemporary equivalent might be for us, how do we grow our church? How can we get more butts in the seats? But Jesus' real purpose is to usher in a new era. If you remember back to Mark chapter 2, Jesus talked about an old wineskin and new wines. You put new wine in new wineskins. He's not trying to fix something old. He's instituting something new. He's inaugurating the birth of a new people, his church that will ultimately result in the restoration of all things. And not just those things right in front of the disciples. Not just those things that are even right in front of us. The disciples are thinking way too small. And that habit, that disease of not understanding God's grand purpose still infects the church today. We still, at Sunshine Ridge and in the church in North America, we're more concerned with the success of our local expression of the church than we are with what God might want to accomplish through us in our neighborhoods and cities. And this is why Peter and the disciples experience a stronger rebuke. Did you catch that? A stronger rebuke than anyone in Mark has yet received. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." He calls Peter Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And I think that the most difficult part of this passage is that this rebuke still hangs in the air for us. Because there are consequences for our lives when we answer that inescapable question, who do you say that I am? And we say, well, we believe you're Messiah. There are consequences to that declaration. From that point on, our priorities, they have to change. Life has to look different because as Messiah, he is also our Lord. He's our King. He gets to tell us what to do. When do we experience this "get behind me, Satan" rebuke? Well, it's when we allow satanic thinking to poison our minds. But what is satanic thinking? Well, It's thinking that's more concerned about the things of man than it is the things of God. Just like Jesus said to Peter, you're more concerned with the things of man than you are the things of God. So whenever your mind wanders personally to, how can I make more money? How can I experience more pleasure? How can I feel better about myself? It even includes those so-called good thoughts, like, how can I earn God's favor? How can I make God more happy with me? How can I make myself more presentable before God? What do I need to do to make myself more worthy of God's love? It's easy to look at Peter and the disciples in that moment and allow ourselves to become judgmental. Like, guys, what are you thinking? You've been with Jesus since the beginning. What is going on here? But the reality is that I experience thoughts like this regularly. And if you don't, then I think you're probably lying. Now, let me remind you of something that should blow your mind. In Matthew's recording of this story, there's a promise that is given between Peter's confession and then Peter receiving the harshest rebuke in Mark. And it goes like this from Matthew chapter 16. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, that's son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now I need to be reminded regularly, and so do you, that satanic thinking is not the end. Satanic thinking is not a death sentence. When my mind is buried in the things of earth, in the concerns of people, rather than the concerns of God, what he wants to see happen in the world, it's just another reminder of how desperately we still need the gospel, the good news of Jesus' atoning work in our lives. Because not only can Peter reach through Peter's small thinking and reach him through and save him through it, but he also intends to do some really intense work in the world through Peter. And so while this harshest of rebukes still hangs in the air for you and me, more important and more powerful than the rebuke is the Jesus who made the solution. Are you plagued by satanic thinking? Are you more concerned with the things of this world than you are with the things of God? Well, of course you are. You will fight against satanic thinking for the rest of your life. But the good news is that Jesus has already won the victory for you, and your job isn't to fight on your own. Your job is to rest in the hands of the one who will fight for you. Last week I went to tuck Violet in the night before she had to go to the dentist, and she gets pretty serious anxiety about any kind of medical appointments, and so the dentist is no different. So we're going to the dentist, and she's just laying in her bed, hands folded over her, eyes closed. And I said, are you going to sleep already? I haven't even said goodnight. And she had tears in her eyes when she opened her eyes. And she just said that she was just reminding herself of the verse that she used to have written on the whiteboard next to her bed. As I mentioned, lots of anxiety around medical type stuff, even the dentist. And so she's just reminding herself of that verse. I said, well, can you say it out loud for me? And her verse is Exodus 14:14. And in her version, which is the NIRV, it says, the Lord will fight for you. Just be still. When satanic thinking threatens to take over your mind, where do you go? It doesn't come naturally to us because we've allowed ourselves to think destructively for so long. We've created these channels, these patterns in our minds that cause us to think so destructively for so long, but we have to go to Jesus. He alone has the power to overcome, and he will fight for you, so just be still. But there's more than that we can do to discipline ourselves. You're always going to struggle with the battle for your mind, even though Jesus has conquered, and it comes down to what you allow in. My dad always used to say this little simple phrase, garbage in, garbage out, when I was a kid. Maybe you've heard that one before. Maybe your dad said it too. I think we all know the reality of that statement. There have been so many shows that Amanda and I have started and given up on for that very reason. Because we get an episode or two in and go, oh my goodness, this is not good for our thinking. And that's a very biblical way to live. I encourage you to be very critical about what you allow in that causes you to think the way that you think. Paul wrote this letter to the Philippian church, and he's giving some final instructions. And he's pleading the church, saying, please, you guys, you have to get along in unity. And he tells them that they can rejoice together, that they can replace anxiety with thanksgiving. And then in Philippians 4:8, he ends with this. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Because this is how the mind works, right? Garbage in, garbage out. But if we surround ourselves, if we think about these true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable things, then our mind starts to work that way. If we practice what we've seen and heard and received from the Bible, that's where the God of peace will come and be with us. Amanda and I were just talking about this passage with somebody really important to us this last week. Who was just saying, I don't want to think about the things that I'm thinking about anymore. Romans 12 talks so well about renewing our minds. Well, what is renewing our minds? God does that work in us. But we can participate in that by Philippians 4, whatever is true and honorable, right? Whatever is just and pure and lovely. The reality is that you can't just convince yourself to stop satanic thinking. You can't just decide, now I'm done. But God has given us his Spirit who lives in us. He convicts us of wrong thinking. He gives us the power to replace it with true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, and commendable things. And that's things like God's plan on earth. See, Peter and the guys, they were caught up in that moment, right? How can we get back to the glory days? How can we get back to the good old days when Israel was all this? But Jesus always intended to pull them forward into something new, right? That new wineskin, that new garment. Or maybe for us, keeping our eyes firmly backwards on the way things used to be is just as satanic thinking as Peter's thinking was. Jesus, let's get things back to the way they used to be. Israel used to be this awesome cultural center, and maybe we go, Sunshine Ridge used to be this huge church. We used to have 450 people. But what it comes down to is that Peter and the disciples, they wanted the easy way out. And instead, Jesus is inviting them to walk the way of the cross. Come and walk the way of suffering. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be rewarding. Well, what does suffering for the gospel look like for us? I'm sure it's a lot different than what it was in biblical times. I think we can all agree on that one, right? I don't have any friends who have been carted off to prison because they were talking about Jesus yet. I've yet to hear of anyone in Canada who was dragged out into the street and shot because they were a Christian. These things may come. I can't imagine it being in my lifetime. I'm not going to say it won't, but they may. Well, one thing COVID has taught us is how little it takes for the church to give up. Our numbers are declining, but I think I want to be okay with that. I think I'm all right with that. Not because I want to be able to brag to my friends about how I grew a church of 170 down to 50 people or whatever it is, but because I'm hopeful of what Sunshine Ridge can do and be as the Spirit inhabits his people and we get serious about the gospel. Don't get me wrong, I hope we grow numerically. But what if we don't? Church, we are sent to Surrey and North Delta as full-time missionaries, not as an organization, but as a people. God uses a variety of different methods to pay you for your missionary work. And you have to be faithful to do that work to the best of your ability. But if you follow Jesus, your life, your all of life vocation is a missionary. You are an ambassador for Christ now and for the rest of your life. You don't get breaks from that. You can't vacation from that. You don't take lunch from that. And you certainly can't retire from that. And don't worry, we'll talk a little bit more about that next week as we talk about the way of suffering. So what does suffering look like in our context? Well, it's just living radically generous lives for the sake of the gospel. Giving of our time and our talents and our resources to build the kingdom in our own neighborhoods, to empower the rest of the church to be able to do things like that here in our family and then wherever God may send us. Let me tell you, one day Sunshine Ridge will expire. Our time in Surrey and North Delta will expire. God will move on to a different group of people. He'll call you maybe to a different group of people. While you're there, while we're here, we want to be as faithful as we can to serving God, to being pulled forward into that new thing, inaugurated into that new people. So now as we look to get back to the fall, with whatever surprises life and COVID restrictions might have for us, one thing hasn't changed. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He is God himself become man, who wants to bring out a major transformation in each one of our lives so that we can be empowered and equipped to go back into the places where we've been sent to demonstrate life and under the rule and reign of this new king. And then to declare the good news that this life is not just for us, but for everyone. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you that you have been so faithful. We thank you that you have made a way. When we were unfaithful, you are still faithful. When we continue to be unfaithful, you are still faithful. Father, I ask that you would remind each one of us of the truth of the gospel as we consider words like renewing our minds, as we consider the things of God rather than the things of the world. Would you grow a greater awareness of you in our lives? Help us to trust you. Father, I pray for my brothers and sisters today as they go about whatever you call them into, whatever you send them into, that you would be made much of in their lives. Father, you are so faithful. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, we are physically in person. We're going to celebrate communion together. And I would encourage you, whoever you're with, even if you're by yourself, stop and take a few moments to reflect on the body and blood of Christ and how that has bought freedom for you and sent you into the world with new purpose. Be blessed, family. Go and be the church.